NTR, natorare. A literal translation equates to be taken out of sleep. The more elegant translation, getting cut. Typically, NTR refers to a rather controversial fetish in ACG-related adult entertainment, where a character indulges in intimate activity with another that's not the intended or primary love interest. In a twisted way, it's meant to invoke jealousy in certain characters or audiences, and, well, some people get off to that. Look, what you goon to is none of my business, but today I want to cover this topic in a way I think most people have heard of one or two instances of. The use of NTR can get a lot more sinister and severe when used in the context of gacha games. I want to cover the overall dynamic surrounding this topic, several cases of it happening, and whether or not there really is another layer to the story. I think a lot of Western players tend to brush off NTR debacles as just another everyday case of a vocal, unhinged minority of incels that lash out at the slightest hint that their beloved waifus are suggesting anything remotely affectionate towards another male character. Depending on the platform and community you talk to, this topic might just end here. Of course, the world consists of many societies. What's considered the norm in the West may seem foreign and weird to those overseas, and vice versa. After looking into a lot of these debacles, this will be my attempt at recontextualizing the issue of NTR-related controversies in gacha games, and why maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't just brush off these scandals as something surface level. I need to preface this saying that I am by no means an expert on this topic of gender politics, and this video will be highly opinionated at times, hence why it's on the second channel. We'll first discuss what exactly is so significant regarding the topic of NTR in gacha games. In case you haven't noticed, the majority of gacha games are meant to create a fantasy. The fantasy that you are the center of the universe and all the characters are affectionate towards you. Since the company has a financial incentive to make you spend your money and resources to pull for characters, considering that's the main breadwinner for this model of mobile games, it's synergistic that they will want to design the characters in a way where they have little to no flaws, see you as their hero or significant other, or has unwavering loyalty to the player protagonist. If you look at it like that, it's almost less so about selling the characters, but rather selling you the idea of this fantasy to you. When this cycle is disturbed, even when it's not explicit or seems implausible, that is enough to cause uproar within the community. There's a few cookie-cutter cases I can think of when this issue was brought up. I would like to go through them in the severity of its impact within gacha games. Exhibit 1. The Girls Frontline 2 Raymond Incident. Before the game launched its global servers, the game was absolutely not a massive success in China. Data miners found out that in an unreleased event, there were drafts featuring the T-Doll character Type 95, based off of an automatic rifle firearm model originally manufactured in China. Of course, she's known as Diane in the game in regards to giving the dolls humanoid names. In this proposed draft, Diane would form an insinuated friendship with another male character called Raymond. The story goes something like this. Diane arrives at a festival. After being enthralled by her singing, the gentleman Raymond goes up to her and requests that she leave the festival grounds, as he is secretly planning an attack of terrorism by bombing the place, and did not want her to be caught in the radius. However, after some exchanges, Diane was able to calm Raymond down, saving the festival, and Raymond is eventually detained. That is, before leaving a letter for Diane where he outlines the importance of their friendship, thanking her for letting him see reason and grow as a person. Whoa, Mr. Raymond? Exchanging letters? Seems a little sus to me. I sure hope the game isn't suggesting something more than just friendship between these two. Now, none of this information was presented within the game. These were data mined, and you can even listen to the voice lines in multiple languages today if you looked hard enough. Of course, the damage was already done by the time people found out about this. This would go on to explain the rather poor launch of Exilium in China, with people boycotting the game and memeing on this whole topic. Generally, Western media don't tend to have these dynamics due to cultural differences. If this event was released to a Western market, some players might have even thought the story was admirable. Our Type 95 that was under our command in the first game is now exploring the world, becoming an independent person capable of influencing others for the good. In the West, people did get upset about the Klukai summer skin due to its inflated pricing, but anything related to the Raymond incident was never brought up as concerns. The global onlookers just played the game while feeling confused why this was even an issue in the first place. Ironically, it's arguable that because of the cultural differences, the global server's launch may have even saved the game. Overall, I would describe this as one of many instances of how a simple creative decision can have catastrophic consequences. Who was at fault here? The way I see it, you could argue this one of two ways. Was it the player's fault for having too much investment in parasocial relationships with fictional characters, or was it the writer's fault for misunderstanding what the fanbase of the game wants out of it? I mean, the whole premise of GFL is having an army of weaponized android waifus fight for you, with even features to oath them, basically implying the equivalent of marriage. Of course, the fans would want similar dynamics in the sequel, so many would say this was the writer's fault for being out of touch with the fans. In any case, I would personally put this one in the tamer side in terms of the attention it drummed up. Snowbreak is a game with some, very cultured gameplay. Originally marketed as a post-apocalyptic third-person shooter with anime graphics, the game has basically done a 180 in its tone. It's almost unrecognizable from its 2023 release. And, well, there's a reason for that. Snowbreak was the first gacha game I reviewed in my long-running series, and I caught it at the time when it was just beginning to shift its direction. Arguably, this version of Snowbreak is the whole reason it's even alive, as the game was not picking enough steam to be sustainable when it launched, and the English voiceovers had to be discontinued. However, Amazing Season Games snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, and because of this tonal change, the game has flourished once again. On Chinese social media sites, the game's official channel has the equivalent of a couple million followers. At the same time, this shift in its direction also meant that the game attracted a different type of fans. Ones that would be overly enthusiastic about buying into this fantasy where they're the Giga Chad surrounded by waifu characters. At the time, the devs were praised when they preemptively made changes to the game in order to provide transparency and demonstrated that they care about their fans. For one, the relic system in the game is called Logistics, where you collect 3 officers of a certain set to activate some buffs. Well, prior to an update, there were male logistics officers in the game too, with their backstories laid out in the description. In order to prevent any sort of NTR debacles and suggestions with said characters having implied relationships to any of the in-game characters, they were changed to female counterparts. There was also a case where they banned some cosplayers that had a record of posting pro-feminist sentiments. This may seem kind of extreme to some, except on the contrary, they were celebrated for the quick response to its fans. I mean, there's that whole devs listened meme, except isn't that true here? They really listened to what their core player base wanted, even if it meant indulging them further in the parasocial aspects of the game. Today, I sometimes play Snowbreak myself. It's honestly a good game with excellent fan service. While I think the majority of people can distinguish what's fiction and reality, I think one of the dangers when designing a game like this is that while it's extremely profitable, you have to consider that your audience may buy into the fantasy you're selling too much. After the cosplayer incident, fans of the game would go through background checks of all the cosplayers to ensure they didn't see anything they didn't like. The Snowbreak case didn't just pose an example of a one-off scenario where the creative vision some writers had clashed with that of the fanbases, but the cultivation of an entire audience that don't like it when anything that can remotely disturb the perfect vision they have for the game surfaces. The next and final example features a gacha game made by a South Korean studio. Let me just say one thing here. I myself am not Korean, nor have I lived in South Korea. I can't even begin to imagine the experience of everyday living there. The information I present will be based on publicly available information, but I do want to add a layer of nuance to the whole situation rather than just, haha, Korean incels. Yes, we're going there. I would like to first bring up this particular image. According to Wikipedia, this is the logo for the Magalia movement in South Korea in the mid-2010s. It's described as a radical feminist movement that tried enforcing extremist beliefs meant to defamiliarize misogynist ideas. Today, I imagine it's meant to loosely describe any form of radical feminism. The gesture here, of course, is meant to mock the small size of the male genitalia. In 2023, Nexon of MapleStory released a controversial animated trailer that will go on to fuel what is referred to as the Korean gender war. In this bubbly and upbeat animation lies something extremely sinister. Did you catch that? Let's rewind. Right there. This singular frame of the character seems to mimic a finger pinch, one that's on the insignia of the Magalia movement. There must be someone with extreme feminist beliefs working at Nexon that secretly implanted this hate message here. This single frame in the trailer would spark a snowball effect, It received coverage from national news, with the backlash being so extreme that the CEO of Nexon went on a livestream apologizing to ensure that there will be a proper investigations done to seek out the malicious party involved in planting such a hateful symbol in the animated trailer. Long story short, the investigation concluded that there was no possible way that this was malicious, but it didn't matter in the end. The finger-pinching conspiracy theory involves this mindset that extremist feminist movements have embedded themselves in every corner of the media, in a covert way to enforce their radical beliefs through these symbols. It sounds utterly absurd, but this whole incident has basically turned the topic of gender politics from a kindling to a roaring bonfire. The effects of this can be seen even today. In an attempt to save themselves from the same controversy at the time, a lot of gacha game devs preemptively started editing their in-game art in the Korean version to avoid any possible chance of being embroiled in this mess. Here are some online advertisements for the iPhone Air, the South Korean version on the top with the English and Japanese versions right under. Do you notice something different about it? Even major world-renowned companies like Apple have to consider the cultural appropriateness in how their products are being marketed and carried out, because this whole finger-pinching incident goes far beyond just some minority of incels being triggered at every single thing. If there's even an inkling of suggestion that a piece of media is involved in this gesture, there's generally an overwhelming amount of backlash that demands it to be corrected. Take a look at the recent cases for Nikkei and Stella Sora. Both instances had either an animation or poster where the gesture can be seen, and they were promptly changed after awareness about them had been spread around. Now, what does this have to do with NTR in gacha games? Well, we will see what an example of a debacle like this will look like when applied to today's scene. Now that the gender war is in full swing, I present what a real NTR piece of drama looks like, featuring Chaos Zero Nightmare. Now, I love this game. I've been playing it regularly for personal enjoyment, and its deck-building roguelike gameplay loop is honestly very refreshing. The story, however, is basically nonsensical. One of the reasons it scored number 2 on my top 5 most anticipated gacha games of 2025 was that I thought, based on the trailers and promotional materials, it was actually trying to dive into more serious topics like trauma or horror elements. This is not what the actual version of the game presents. Most people just zone it out since the gameplay basically carries the game. There's even a planned update to rework the story to something that's more faithful to its original version. That begs the question, what happened with this version of the story to begin with? Why deviate from its darker and more serious tone? Well, you may have heard of the whole Owen NTR debacle when it launched. Basically, Owen, a male character, has some dialogue where he's suspiciously close with some of the other female cast members. While most Western fans brushed it off as a classic case of Korean incels at it again, the more I looked into this, I realized that this went deeper than I thought. So the result of this incident prompted an apology from the director of Super Creative, and every player was compensated 50 limited pulls. That's an insane amount of free stuff just from this one NTR mishap. Surely there's something else at play, right? Well, yes, actually. If you take a look at what exactly the CEO of Super Creative was apologizing for, the results may suggest something more sinister than just Owen cucking players. Now, I don't speak Korean, but I was able to scrape the livestream transcript and auto-translate it. There's also a post corroborating most of what the translation displayed. It's not perfect, but I think I got the general idea. In a nutshell, the original vision for Chaos Zero Nightmare was vastly different from what it is now. According to some leakers that data mined some information, the reason that the protagonist's title is the Protos, or First, in Korean, is that the main protagonist would have had time loop abilities to travel back in time again and again in an attempt to save everyone. That's the reason why the gacha is called Rescue. That's why the time rewind mechanic to retry dice rolls and restart the turn exists. It's not just a cool little gameplay feature, but was actually meant to tie into the original vision for the game. This is also the reason the trauma code side stories exist. According to this online user, Owen was supposed to be an orphan child, then meant to be a sacrificial lamb at the age of 10, which then would become your foster child? I have no clue if any of this is real, but it does sound more interesting than what we got now. I thought this all sounded absurd, except if you look at the evidence, it kinda lines up. Some disgruntled players data mined some internal info, and here are some scraped in-game art that clearly depict more Lovecraftian horror aspects. What I can't state as facts is what the director of the game said during the apology livestream. Here are some key points. The original vision of the game was indeed a time loop plot where the protagonist had the power to rewind time. This now exists as a much simpler version, but the original premise was there. The director also admitted that he caused interference in the original writer's work, to the point that they left the company. What was the reason? Well, I don't know for sure. Certain creative disagreements, maybe. While I didn't see anything mentioning radical feminism, this seemed to be the running theory among the Korean fanbase. While the director did point out the company does not follow any particular politics or ideologies, to the Korean players, it's not just a case of, haha, NTR makes people mad. In my opinion, a good chunk of people were justifiably upset that due to this news coming to light, as no matter where the interference came from, the game's story did get degraded to the point of what it is now. And their argument is that you shouldn't just be content with the 50 free pulls, as that might just lead to the same thing happening in the future. Of course, while I think there were valid criticisms surrounding how the current version of the game's story vastly differ from its original vision, some of the lengths people took to berate the company does seem out of line. Obviously, if you get triggered by a hand gesture in its natural resting position, that's very clearly some unhinged behavior. There were absolutely players that overreacted to Owen having insinuated relationships with some of the characters, and this likely contributed to the future direction the story rewrite is going in. In the stream summary, the first couple chapters of the main story will be completely rewritten, with focus on removing narrative structures where the protagonist's importance is overshadowed by other characters, where controversial characters will undergo reviews, and will not have any romantic pairings. In a nutshell, to a lot of Western players, it's basically going the Snowbreak route where you're the self-insert protagonist and the whole universe revolves around you. However, there was also a promise that the revised story will maintain its dark tone and psychological depth, so the chance that it aligns more with the original vision is still there. Either way, I'd be glad if the game reached the point where it matched my expectations when I first heard about it. But if it does turn out to go the Snowbreak direction, nothing's really gonna change for me since I wasn't playing it for the story anyways. Overall, while most Western players just brush this off as a classic example of the usual NTR drama, the KL0 Nightmare case represented not just how hypersensitive the topic of gender politics is to certain cultures, but how said influences possibly can impact core components of a gacha game. What I am trying to say is that I think we should be aware of the cultural, social, and political differences between Western countries and those that make gacha games. Things that may seem weird and outrageous may not seem so over there. You can't ever experience life as someone else living across the world, so it becomes an issue of, I don't know what I don't know. So the next time an Eastern community raises a fuss over another NTR debacle, it might just be worthwhile to dig further to see the full context. Anyways, thank you for joining me today on this very divisive topic. This script has been sitting in my documents for months since I didn't know if it made sense talking about this kind of stuff, but I hope you learned something. In any case, thank you for watching, be sure to spend moderately, and have fun out there.